There are moments in life that divide your existence into before and after. For me, that moment arrived on an autumn morning in Chicago, when my son Lucas crossed the invisible line that separates the ordinary world from the underworld I was desperately trying to avoid. I didn't know, that morning while preparing breakfast with trembling hands and a black eye poorly concealed by makeup, that in the next few hours, my life would take a completely unexpected turn. I lived for years believing I could manage the situation. Marco, my ex-husband, hadn't always been violent. There was a time when his hands touched me with tenderness, when his eyes sparkled looking at newborn Lucas. But the gambling debt started small and grew like weeds, suffocating the man I had loved until only a bitter and violent shell remained. When I discovered he owed money not just to ordinary loan sharks, but to the Santoro family, the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago, I knew we were in dangerous territory. Marco started working for them, making deliveries he never specified, coming home with glazed eyes and an increasingly explosive temper. That specific morning, everything began with an argument about money. It was always about money. Or about my supposed infidelity, a paranoia fueled by the cocaine he now consumed regularly. I was in the kitchen when I heard Lucas stirring in his room, and my first thought was to keep him away, to protect him from seeing another scene that would be etched into his 6-year-old memory. But Marco was beyond reason. When I tried to leave the kitchen, he pushed me against the refrigerator hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I heard Lucas's scream from the bedroom door, that high-pitched sound of terror no mother should hear from her child. What happened in the following minutes is still hazy in my memory. I remember yelling for Lucas to run, using that firm voice we reserve for emergencies, the one children instinctively obey. I remember the sound of the front door opening, the small footsteps descending the stairs of our apartment. I remember Marco realizing too late that the boy had fled, and his fury turning entirely on me. There were punches, kicks, and at some point my head hit the corner of the kitchen table with a sound that echoed inside my skull. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I thought, with that strange clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme moments, that I might die there, on the floor of my own kitchen, while my son ran through the streets of Chicago seeking help that probably wouldn't come. But Lucas was smarter than I imagined, braver too. He knew the street stories, the ones children whisper in playgrounds about the powerful men who controlled the neighborhoods. He knew that 3 blocks south there was an Italian restaurant where black cars were always parked, where men in suits never smiled, but where the owner supposedly had a code. My 6-year-old son, with tears streaming down his face and his heart pounding so hard he later told me he thought it would explode, ran straight to the lion's den. He entered Ristorante Lucia, past the security guards who were so surprised they didn't react in time, and did something very few would dare. He interrupted Dante Santoro's morning meeting. Dante Santoro was a name spoken in hushed tones in Chicago. At 32, he had consolidated an empire his father had started decades ago, expanding from the Italian neighborhoods to dominate entire sectors of the city. They said he was ruthless in business, lethal with traitors, but that he maintained an old-fashioned code of honor that included protecting the weak and punishing those who hurt women and children. Of course, these were romanticized stories that circulated to give a Robin Hood veneer to a man who controlled trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. I never believed those stories. To me, powerful men were all the same, variations on the same theme of control and violence. Lucas later told me, with that still trembling voice but full of childish admiration, what it was like to enter that restaurant. How the men in suits immediately stood up, hands going to hidden weapons. How an older woman, who he would later know was Rosa, the restaurant manager, and a maternal figure in Dante's life, tried to gently hold him back. And how a tall man with dark hair and eyes, Lucas described as cold but not cruel, raised a hand, making everyone stop. Dante Santoro looked at my son and, instead of anger for having his meeting interrupted, Lucas saw something that made him trust. He saw recognition, as if the most powerful man in Chicago understood exactly the desperation that had driven him there. Lucas said only 6 words, but they were enough to change everything. He's hurting my mom. He didn't directly ask for help, didn't make dramatic appeals. He just stated the fact with that brutal honesty only children possess, expecting the adult in front of him to do what was right. And Dante Santoro, to everyone's surprise in the room, crouched down to Lucas's level, and with a voice surprisingly gentle for someone of his reputation, asked where I was. Lucas gave our address, 3 blocks north, apartment 307. Dante nodded once, said something to his men that made them all move like a well-oiled machine, and then did something unexpected. He asked Rosa to take care of Lucas, promising he would return with me. Topic 2. the rescue, and the first encounter. I was semi-conscious on the kitchen floor when I heard the apartment door being literally kicked in. The sound of splintering wood brought me back to consciousness, and my first terrified thought was that Marco had called reinforcements, that the nightmare was just beginning. I tried to get up, but my body didn't respond properly. Through blurred vision, I saw several figures enter the apartment quickly, and I heard Marco start babbling something, his voice rising in a mix of panic and simultaneous aggression. Then I heard another voice, deep and controlled, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout to be obeyed. The voice said only my name, Sophia, like a question. I forced my eyes to focus and saw a tall man blocking the light from the kitchen door, his silhouette surrounded by other smaller figures. He entered the kitchen fully, and when he crouched beside me, I could finally see his face. Marked features, strong jaw, eyes of a stormy gray that at that moment contained not the coldness I would expect, but something close to contained fury. Dante Santoro was on the floor of my kitchen, assessing my injuries with the precision of someone who had seen too much violence in his life. He didn't ask dramatic questions about whether I was okay, which I would appreciate later when I could process everything. Instead, he shouted for someone named Antonio, who appeared with a first aid kit. Dante began carefully cleaning the cut on my temple, his hands surprisingly gentle for someone so feared. I must have been in shock because everything seemed to be happening through a watery filter, slow and distorted. I heard Marco trying to explain, his voice mixing apologies with veiled threats, saying I was his wife, that it was a family matter, that Mr. Santoro certainly understood that sometimes women needed to be disciplined. The silence that followed those words was absolute and terrifying. Dante stopped tending to me for a moment, his fingers frozen in the air. Then, without looking at Marco, he said something in Italian that made the other men in the room move. Two of them grabbed Marco, who started screaming and thrashing. Dante finally looked at him, and even in my confused state, I could feel the temperature change in the room. The gentleness he showed me disappeared completely, replaced by something cold and final. Dante told Marco, in a low but perfectly audible voice, that men who hit women weren't real men. They were cowards in disguise. He said that anyone who worked for his organization and broke that fundamental rule ceased to exist for him. And then, turning his attention back to me, he asked if I had somewhere to go, if there was family, some safe place. My response was a bitter laugh that came out more like a sob. My family had disowned me when I married Marco against their advice. I had no close friends. Marco had made sure to isolate me over the years. I had no money of my own, no options. It was exactly where he wanted me. Dante nodded, as if my answer confirmed something he already knew. Then he made a statement that at the time seemed absurd, but that would completely change the course of my life. He said that Lucas and I would go with him, that we would stay at one of his properties until the situation was resolved. Resolved, in that context, had meanings I preferred not to explore too deeply. I tried to protest, to say I couldn't accept charity from a criminal, that I didn't want to owe favors to someone like him. The words came out jumbled and weak, and Dante simply looked at me with an expression that mixed patience and determination. He said, and I still remember the exactness of his words, that I owed him nothing, that it wasn't charity but a matter of principles. He said his father had taught him that power without a moral code is just tyranny, and that protecting those who cannot protect themselves was part of that code. It sounded too noble to be real, part of me thought cynically, but another part, the part that was exhausted from living in fear, desperately wanted to believe it. When he extended his hand to help me up, I hesitated only a second before taking it. His fingers were firm and warm, and when he gently pulled me to my feet, I had to lean lightly against him because my legs weren't fully cooperative. I was led out of the apartment by one of Dante's men, someone who introduced himself as Antonio and had surprisingly courteous manners. As we descended, I heard sounds of confrontation upstairs, and a part of me, the part that still held some residue of feeling for the man Marco once was, felt a pang, but it was small, almost insignificant compared to the overwhelming relief of leaving there. A black SUV waited on the street, discreet, but clearly expensive. Antonio helped me into the back seat, and moments later, Lucas was being brought from the restaurant, running into my arms as soon as he saw me. I hugged my son hard enough to make him complain that I was squeezing too tight, and the tears I had held back finally flowed freely. Lucas whispered in my ear, with that childish seriousness that breaks the heart, that the tall man had promised to save me and had kept his promise. He asked if we were safe now, if the bad man wouldn't come back. I didn't know what to answer, so I just held my son and nodded, desperately wishing it were true. Dante entered the vehicle shortly after, his eyes quickly assessing how I was, noting Lucas clinging to me. He said nothing about what had happened upstairs, and I didn't ask. Some things were better not to know. During the drive to his property, I watched the city pass by the tinted window. Chicago, my hometown, suddenly seemed different, as if I were seeing it for the first time through altered lenses. We were heading north, to the wealthier neighborhoods I only knew in passing. Dante's property was in Lincoln Park, hidden behind high gates and discreet but effective fences. When we entered, my first impression was of order and beauty. Meticulously maintained gardens, a colonial-style house that exuded old wealth, not the new rich ostentation I would expect from a crime boss. Topic 3. Life in his territory. The first days at Dante's property passed in a strange haze of physical recovery and psychological adjustment. Rosa, the same woman who had cared for Lucas at the restaurant, appeared on the first day as if she were the housekeeper, but I quickly realized she was much more than that. She was an advisor, a maternal figure, and, I suspected, one of the few people who could speak frankly to Dante without fear of repercussions. She installed me in a suite on the second floor, spacious and elegantly decorated in neutral tones, with an adjacent room for Lucas that had enough toys to thrill any child. Rosa didn't ask invasive questions about my situation, didn't look at me with pity or judgment. She simply said the house had rules, that I was free to come and go in the common areas, that meals were served at specific times, but the kitchen was always available if Lucas or I needed something off schedule. She also said, with a significant look, that Dante had instructed all the security personnel on the property to treat me with respect and ensure our safety above all else. I felt simultaneously grateful and uncomfortable with that level of protection, as if I had traded one prison for a more comfortable one. Lucas, with children's adaptability, adjusted more quickly than I did. In 3 days, he already knew by name all the staff members who worked on the property. There was James, the head of security, a huge man of Jamaican origin who had a surprisingly gentle smile and infinite patience with Lucas's endless questions. There was Maria, the cook, who quickly discovered my son's favorite snack and always had fresh cookies when he appeared in the kitchen. And there was obviously Rosa, whom Lucas adopted as an honorary grandmother, following her around the house and chattering about everything and nothing. Dante was a more distant presence. In the first days, I saw him only briefly, usually in the morning when he left for his business, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. He politely asked how we were, if we needed anything, but maintained a professional distance that left me simultaneously relieved and curious. There was a restraint in him, a rigid control over his emotions that I recognized because I had developed something similar during my years with Marco. It was a survival mechanism, an invisible armor against a world that was rarely kind. It was on the 5th day that we had our first real conversation. I was in the library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that seemed to have been actually read, not just placed there for decoration. I was leafing through an old edition of Italian poetry when Dante entered, stopping upon seeing me as if he hadn't expected to find anyone there. There was a moment of mutual hesitation before he fully entered, closing the door behind him. He apologized for interrupting, said he just wanted to get a book, but the way his eyes scanned the room suggested he came there seeking more than literature. I told him he didn't need to apologize in his own house, and there was a brief smile on his lips, the first I saw. It completely transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him seem younger, more human. He commented that he was pleased to see I was enjoying the library, that most of his guests never entered there. The word guests made me laugh, a humorless sound. We both knew I wasn't exactly a guest in the traditional sense. Dante didn't deny it, just approached the nearest shelf and pulled out a volume, his hands handling the book with familiar care. I asked if he really read, or if the books were just scenery. The question came out more challenging than I intended, residue perhaps of the anger I still carried, not directed at him specifically, but at the world in general that had put me in that situation. Dante didn't seem offended. Instead, he opened the book he held, Divine Comedy in the original Italian edition, and recited a few verses from memory. His voice had a different quality when he spoke Italian, more melodic, less controlled. He translated for me without my asking, Dante Alighieri's words about love and redemption, seeming strangely appropriate coming from Dante Santoro. We spent almost an hour talking in that library, and it was the first time since my marriage that I had a real intellectual conversation with someone. I discovered that Dante had been partially educated in Italy, that he had studied literature and history before family circumstances pulled him into his father's business. There was a subtle sadness when he spoke of paths not taken, choices that weren't really choices but obligations in disguise. I recognized that feeling intimately. I told him about my own interrupted education, How I was one semester away from finishing my law degree when I met Marco. How I gradually abandoned everything, giving up piece by piece of myself until I almost didn't recognize who I was. Dante listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. When I finished, he simply said it wasn't too late, that I was still young, that people reinvented themselves all the time. It sounded nice, but implausible. I was 29, with a child, no professional skills beyond being a survivor, and living on favor in a criminal's house while hiding from an abusive husband with dangerous connections. Not exactly a solid foundation for reinvention. He must have seen the skepticism on my face, because Dante added something that made me stop. He said his mother, who had died when he was 12, used to say that the difference between surviving and living was the courage to believe you deserved more than just not being dead. Topic 4. Revelations from the past. The weeks turned into a month, and gradually we established a strange but functional routine. Lucas began lessons with a tutor Dante hired, a retired gentleman named Professor Alberti, who had infinite patience and teaching methods that made my son actually enjoy learning. I started helping Rosa with various household tasks, not because she needed it, but because I needed to feel useful, to contribute in some way instead of just passively accepting everything being given to us. Rosa protested initially, but eventually accepted my help, mainly with organizing the extensive library and some light administrative work related to Dante's legitimate properties. Yes, apparently the Mafia boss had legitimate businesses, restaurants, a handful of real estate properties, an import company. Rosa explained, with that frankness I had come to appreciate, that the Santoro family had been slowly trying to transition to completely legal operations for 2 generations. Dante's father had started the process, and Dante was continuing it, though the reality was that you don't just walk away from the Mafia when you want. There were obligations, territories to maintain, old loyalties that couldn't simply be discarded without bloody consequences. It was on a late night, when Lucas was already asleep and I was on the back porch of the house enjoying the cool October air, that Dante told me more about himself. He appeared with 2 cups of tea, offering one to me before sitting in the adjacent chair. The gesture was casual, but there was a tension in him, as if he were about to reveal something important and wasn't sure how it would be received. He started by asking about my family, the parents who had disowned me, the siblings who had stopped speaking to me when I chose Marco. I answered honestly that my family was traditional, second-generation Italian immigrants who had rigid expectations about how their daughters should behave. When I fell in love with Marco, who wasn't Italian, who came from a troubled family and had no clear prospects, they gave me an ultimatum, him or them. I chose him, with the arrogance of 22 thinking love conquered everything. Obviously, I was wrong. Dante listened without judging, and then began his own story. His father, Giovanni Santoro, had been a man feared and respected in equal measure. He had built his empire with intelligence and brutality when necessary, but always maintained a strict code. Family above all, loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished without mercy, and protection for the weak in the neighborhood. Dante grew up knowing exactly what his father did. There were no illusions or comfortable lies in his family. When he was 12, there was a territorial war with a rival family. His father had been the target, but it was his mother who died, caught in the crossfire while leaving the market. Dante described that day with a voice devoid of emotion, but his eyes told a different story. He said something broke in his father after his mother's death, that the brutality increased while the humanity diminished. Giovanni Santoro eliminated the rival family completely, not just the leaders, but entire branches of the family tree, ensuring there would be no generational revenge. Dante was sent to Italy soon after, officially to study and know the family roots, but in reality, to keep him safe while the war ended. He spent 6 years there, from 13 to 19, living with uncles and cousins, having a relatively normal student life. It was the happiest period of his life, he said with a touch of nostalgia, because for the first time he wasn't the Mafia boss's son, he was just Dante, a boy who loved books and history, and who dreamed of perhaps being a teacher. But of course, reality eventually caught up with him. His father had a severe heart attack when Dante was 19. He was called back, initially just to visit, but Giovanni was dying, and there were businesses to resolve. Dante's father lived 3 more years after that first attack, enough time to train his son in all aspects of the business, to introduce him to all the important contacts, to ensure a smooth transition of power. Dante described those 3 years as the hardest of his life, having to learn not just criminal logistics, but also how to be feared, how to make decisions that affected lives. how to balance personal morality with the brutal realities of the world he had inherited. When Giovanni finally died, Dante was 22 and had an empire in his hands that he never really wanted, but that was now his inescapable responsibility. I asked why he was telling me all this, why he was revealing so much to someone who was essentially a stranger. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dark garden in front of us. Then he said something that made my heart race. He said he wasn't entirely sure, that normally he didn't talk about these things with anyone, that there was something about me, about the way I had survived and still maintained dignity, that made him want me to know. That he wasn't just the monster his reputation suggested, that there was more to him, even if the world never saw it. And he said, with a vulnerability that must have cost a man accustomed to wearing masks dearly, that it had been a long time since he felt seen as a person, not as a position. I didn't know what to respond to that. There was an intimacy growing between us that went beyond savior and saved, beyond host and guest. It was dangerous and inappropriate in many ways, but also undeniable. When his hand moved to cover mine on the table between us, I didn't pull away. We stayed like that for an indefinite time, two survivors of different wars, finding temporary solace in each other's company. Topic 5. The threat returns. The illusion of safety lasted almost 2 months before reality caught up with us. October turned to November, and Chicago was beautiful in that melancholic way of cities transitioning to winter. Lucas was flourishing under Professor Alberti's care, and I had begun to feel almost normal, almost as if we could really build a new life from the ruins of the old. I should have known it was too soon for hope. Peace never lasts when you build it on unstable foundations. Antonio, whom I had learned was Dante's right-hand man and responsible for the organization's operational intelligence, appeared one morning with a grave expression that immediately put me on alert. He asked to speak with me and Dante privately, and the tone brooked no refusal. I sat in the formal living room, a room we rarely used, feeling my stomach tighten with apprehension. Dante entered moments later, and the way his eyes immediately sought me out, checking if I was okay, did something strange to my chest. When had he become so attuned to me? When had I started to trust that look? Antonio didn't waste time. Marco had been released, he said bluntly. Apparently, without my formal complaint and without my testimony, there wasn't enough case to hold him. Domestic assault charges required the victim's cooperation, and since I had disappeared, the system simply let him go with a warning. But there was more. Marco was now working directly for the Calabresi, a rival family that had been trying to undermine the Santoro territory for years. He had offered them information about Dante's operations in exchange for protection and a better position than he had before. And most relevant to me, he was looking for Lucas and me. I felt the world narrow around me. All the progress, all the sense of security, evaporated instantly. Lucas. My first thought was my son, currently with Professor Alberti somewhere in the house, happy and carefree. I couldn't let him go back to that life. Couldn't let Marco destroy the fragile beginning we were building. Dante must have seen the panic on my face because he immediately moved to kneel in front of me, his hands holding mine with firm, comforting strength. He said he wouldn't let anything happen to us, that he would increase security, that Marco wouldn't get near. But Antonio interrupted, his voice carrying the pragmatic brutality of experience. He said passive defense wouldn't be enough, that as long as Marco was alive and working with the Calabresi, he would be a constant threat. He said there was only one permanent solution to the problem, and the meaning was clear in the unspoken words. They were suggesting killing my ex-husband. The idea should have horrified me, should have made me recoil in the moral repulsion that a decent person would feel. But all I felt was a dark and shameful relief. If Marco were dead, we would finally be free. Lucas could grow up without fear. I could stop looking over my shoulder. I asked, my voice steadier than I expected, what they needed from me. Dante and Antonio exchanged a glance, and then Dante asked if I had any information about Marco's contacts with the Calabresi, meetings, locations, anything that could give them an advantage. I thought carefully. During my marriage, I had learned to pay attention to the details that Marco thought I ignored. Phone calls he thought I didn't hear. Names mentioned when he was too drunk to be careful. A specific place, a bar called Red Hook in the South Side, where he often went for his more suspicious meetings. Antonio nodded, clearly satisfied with the information. He said he could work with that he had contacts who could watch the place, establish patterns. But then he added something more, something that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The Calabresi were planning something big, a move against the Santoro Central Territory that would involve not just business issues, but the physical elimination of key leaders. They were planning to kill Dante. Marco was probably providing information about the property, routines, vulnerable points that he had observed during his previous deliveries. I looked at Dante and saw not fear, but a weary resignation. This was the world he lived in, where death was always an imminent possibility, where trust was a rare currency, and betrayal was the default behavior. He had lived like this for a decade, since taking over from his father. But for the first time, there was something different in his eyes when he looked at me. There was something to lose beyond power and territory. There was a personal connection that made him more vulnerable than any physical security flaw. The following days passed in a strange haze of preparation and anticipation. Security on the property was tripled. James coordinated a system where Lucas was never alone, always with at least 2 guards disguised nearby. I myself was not allowed to leave the property, not that I wanted to. Dante was often absent, meeting after meeting, preparing for what was to come. When he was home, there was an intensity in him, an urgency that hadn't existed before. It was on one of those nights, when the tension was so thick we could barely breathe, that things changed irreversibly between us. Dante found me in the library, my favorite refuge during those stressful days. He entered without speaking, simply sat beside me on the sofa where I was pretending to read. For a long moment, we just sat in silence, the weight of the unsaid filling the space between us. Then Dante spoke, his voice low and loaded with emotion he normally kept buried. He said that if anything happened to him, Rosa and Antonio had instructions to ensure Lucas and I would be financially secure and protected, that there were documents, accounts, contingency plans. I interrupted before he could continue. I said I didn't want to hear him talk about dying, that after everything he had done for us, the idea of losing him was unbearable. And then, because apparently extreme stress disables social filters, I admitted something I had been trying to ignore for weeks. I said that what I felt for him went far beyond gratitude, that at some point between literary debates and shared dinners and glances that lasted a second longer than appropriate, I had begun to care in a way that was scary and wonderful simultaneously. Dante looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. He said he felt the same, that every night he fought the impulse to cross the hallway to my room, that I had become the first thing he thought of in the morning and the last at night. But he also said he didn't want to pressure me, that I had just come out of an abusive situation, that maybe what I felt was gratitude confused with something more. His consideration, his refusal to take advantage of my vulnerability, only deepened my feelings for him. Then I kissed him. I closed the space between us and pressed my lips against his, and it was as if something broke inside me, all the walls I had built crumbling instantly. Dante hesitated for just a second before responding, his hands coming to frame my face with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of the kiss. It was different from anything I had ever experienced, a kiss that was both promise and confession, both desire and tenderness. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, and his eyes searched mine as if looking for confirmation that this was real, that I wouldn't pull back. I told him, my voice firm despite the emotion, that I knew exactly what I was doing, that it wasn't gratitude or confusion, it was choice. I was choosing him, choosing this, choosing to believe we deserved a chance despite all the complications. Dante pulled me into his arms, and we stayed like that for an indeterminate time, 2 hearts beating in sync, finding solace before the storm we knew was coming. Topic 6. The operation and the final confrontation. The next days were a chaotic mix of tactical planning and stolen moments of intimacy. Dante and Antonio set up an operation that would use Marco as bait to expose the Calabrese's larger plan. The idea was to track Marco to a meeting with his new employers, capture enough evidence of their violent intentions, and then hand it all over to a corrupt detective Dante had on his payroll. Technically, they would be using the legal system against the Calabrese, an irony not lost on any of us. My role would be limited, but crucial. I would provide ongoing information about Marco's habits, help anticipate his moves based on years of forced observation. Antonio set up a temporary command center in one of the property's offices, screens showing surveillance feeds from various locations, including the Red Hook and adjacent areas. It was surreal to see the logistics of organized crime operating like any business operation, spreadsheets and schedules and efficient resource allocation, except the resources were armed men and the goals involved potential violence. The operation was scheduled for a Thursday night, when Antonio's intelligence suggested there would be an important meeting at the Red Hook. Lucas was sent to stay with Rosa at a cousin of Dante's country house, removing him completely from the line of fire. I said goodbye to him with a heavy heart, making him promise to be good and not worry, that Mommy would be fine. He looked at me with those eyes too wise for his age, and made me promise I would come back, that the bad man wouldn't hurt me again. I promised, desperately wishing I could guarantee such a thing. As the night of the operation approached, Dante became visibly tenser. I found him in the house gym around 6 in the evening, punching a heavy bag with an intensity that spoke of the need to release tension. I stopped at the door, simply watching the way his muscles flexed under the sweat-soaked t-shirt, the absolute concentration on his face. He eventually noticed my presence and stopped, grabbing the bag to stabilize it. Our eyes met across the gym space, and an entire conversation happened without words. I approached him, and when I was close enough, Dante reached out, gently pulling me against his chest. I didn't mind that he was sweaty. I simply hugged his waist and let my head rest on his strongly beating heart, both from the exercise and the emotion. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head and whispered that everything would be fine, that by the end of the night we would be free. I wanted to believe him desperately. The operation began at 9 o'clock. Teams were positioned around the Red Hook, discreet but ready to act. Hidden cameras would capture everything. Antonio commanded from the control center, and initially Dante was supposed to remain on the property, away from direct action. But when the feeds showed not just Marco entering the bar, but also 2 of the Calabresi brothers, the real leaders of the rival family, Dante decided to go personally. He said it was a unique opportunity, a chance to cut off the snake's head once and for all. I insisted on going with him. Antonio protested. Dante refused categorically, but I was inflexible. Marco was my responsibility, my nightmare to face. Besides, I argued, my presence could be useful. If Marco saw me, it would be a distraction, something that could force him to make mistakes. It was a weak argument, but deep down both knew I needed to be there, needed to witness the end of that chapter of my life. Reluctantly, Dante agreed, but on the condition that I stay in the command vehicle with Antonio, far from any direct danger. The Red Hook was a decrepit-looking bar in the South Side, the kind of place where questions weren't asked and memories were conveniently short. We parked 2 blocks south, in a vehicle with tinted windows that looked ordinary enough not to attract attention. Through the monitors, we watched Marco meet the Calabresi at a table in the back. The audio quality was surprisingly good, and what we heard confirmed our worst fears. They were indeed planning a direct attack on Dante's property, scheduled for that very night, in the coming hours. Marco had provided not just layouts, but also security codes he had observed during his previous deliveries. Antonio immediately started making calls, alerting the teams on the property, modifying defenses. Dante, sitting in the driver's seat, was frighteningly calm, that deadly calm that precedes violence. He said something on the radio in code I didn't fully understand, but I saw through the monitors several of his men enter the bar, positioning themselves strategically. The plan was shifting from observation to direct confrontation. Marco noticed the change in atmosphere first. I saw him on the monitor lift his head, look around with growing suspicion. The Calabresi were slower to notice. A fatal mistake. Everything happened quickly then. Dante entered the bar with an authority that immediately commanded attention. The place, which had maybe 20 customers besides the targets, fell into absolute silence. Everyone there knew who he was, what he represented. Dante walked straight to the table where Marco and the Calabresi were, and with cutting calm, said he would kindly ask them to leave with him, or he would drag them out by force. It was a formality, an offer everyone knew would be refused. One of the Calabresi brothers, Sal, the oldest and supposed leader, made the mistake of trying to draw a gun. He didn't get close. Dante's men immobilized the 3 before any could react properly. It was efficient, professional, and relatively bloodless, at least inside the bar. Marco was terrified, his eyes wide when he recognized Dante, understanding and fear mixing on his pale face. He shouted something about having rights, about being protected now, about how the Calabresi would avenge anything Dante did. It sounded pathetic and desperate, a man realizing too late that he had made bets he couldn't cover. They were dragged out of the bar, taken to an abandoned warehouse 2 streets away that Antonio had prepared in advance. Against everyone's better judgment, I left the vehicle and followed them. Dante saw me entering the warehouse and his face hardened in disapproval, but he didn't send me away. Maybe he understood that I needed this, needed to look Marco in the eyes without fear for the first time in years. The 3 men were tied to chairs, separated enough not to conspire, but still visible to each other. Dante positioned himself in front of them like a judge about to pronounce sentence. That was when Marco finally saw me. His eyes widened and he started babbling, his voice rising in hysterical pitch. He shouted that I was his wife, that I had betrayed him with Dante, that Lucas was his son and I had no right to keep him away. The falseness of the accusations, the projection, the complete lack of accountability. It was also Marco that I almost laughed. Instead, I approached him slowly until I was standing directly in front of him. For the first time since I had known him, he was the vulnerable one, the powerless one, the one who was afraid. I spoke low, just loud enough for him to hear. I said he had broken any right over me or Lucas the moment he raised his hand the first time. I said he would never come near us again, that his choice to align with the Calabrese against Dante was the last stupid mistake in a life full of them. I saw something break in his eyes, the realization that he had lost, that his path ended there. Part of me felt sorry for the man he once was, but that part was small and quickly silenced by the memory of every bruise, every insult, every moment of terror he had caused me. I stepped back and Dante took my place. What happened in the next hours I won't describe in detail. Suffice it to say that Dante extracted all the necessary information about Calabrese operations, about corrupt police contacts, about supply chains and warehouse locations. And then, decisions were made about fates. The Calabrese brothers were handed over to federal authorities Dante had connections with, along with enough evidence of crimes to ensure decades in prison. It wasn't the death they probably expected, but in many ways it was worse, a slow deterioration in confinement. As for Marco, Dante gave me a choice I never expected. He asked what I wanted to happen to him. He could be handed over to authorities with charges of conspiracy and attempted murder. He could simply disappear, sent far away with a clear warning never to return. Or he could face the kind of justice that men like Dante traditionally administered. The choice was mine. I looked at Marco, that man I once loved, now reduced to this pathetic and trembling thing. I could have chosen revenge, it would be justified. But I realized something important. I didn't want anything more from him, not even the satisfaction of revenge. I just wanted him to cease existing in my life. I told Dante to do what was safest for us, what would ensure Marco was never a threat again. Dante nodded, respecting my decision. Marco was handed over to authorities with enough evidence to ensure years in prison, and more importantly, with news carefully leaked into the prison system about his prior cooperation, ensuring he wouldn't be welcomed by any faction inside. His life as he knew it was over, and he would spend the next years looking over his shoulder, the same way he had forced me to do. Topic 7. The New Beginning and the Love Born from Chaos. The weeks after the operation brought significant changes. With the Calabrese dismantled and Marco permanently neutralized, an unusual peace settled over Dante's territory. Not true peace, because in his world such a thing doesn't really exist, but a pause, a breath between storms. Lucas returned from the country house with stories about the chickens Rosa let him feed and the newborn kittens he had helped care for. He seemed lighter, more genuinely happy than I had ever seen him. The absence of fear was transformative for both of us. As for Dante and me, our relationship evolved in a way that felt both inevitable and surprising. There was no grand declaration or dramatic moment of commitment. Instead, it was a series of small daily choices, constant decisions to be together, to build something real from the unlikely circumstances that had united us. I began sleeping in his room more nights than not, waking with his arms around me, the feeling of security something I was still learning to accept without question. Dinners became family affairs, the three of us at the table with Rosa often joining, conversations flowing naturally about everything from politics to Lucas's latest art project. Dante was gradually bringing me more into his professional world, specifically the legitimate parts. I discovered I had a knack for organization and management that my interrupted education had begun to develop. I started genuinely working with the restaurants, handling administrative aspects, allowing Dante to focus on broader matters. Rosa joked that I was becoming his right hand, but there was truth there. We worked well together, our styles complementary rather than conflicting. Lucas accepted our relationship with the ease of children who simply want their parents to be happy. He started calling Dante by his first name instead of Mr. Santoro, and occasionally, in moments of carelessness, something that sounded dangerously close to Dad. Dante always paused in those moments, an expression of tenderness and fear crossing his face. He was genuinely terrified of failing Lucas, of not being good enough as a father figure. I had to constantly remind him that just caring that much already put him light years ahead of most. 3 months after the operation, on a cold February night, Dante formally asked me to stay. Not as a guest or protected, but as a companion, as a permanent part of his life. We were in the library, where so many important conversations had taken place, and he was visibly nervous in a way I had never seen him before. He said he knew his world wasn't ideal, that there were dangers and complications that would always exist. He said he couldn't promise a normal life or a traditional family, but he could promise absolute loyalty, limitless protection, and a love that had surprised him as much as it probably surprised me. My response was to kiss him, long and deep, putting into that kiss all the feelings I still struggled to express in words. When we pulled apart, I said yes. Obviously yes, because where else would I be but with the man who saved my son, who gave me back my life, who showed me that I deserved to be loved without conditions. That night, for the first time, we talked about a real future. About legalizing my divorce situation, something Dante said he could accelerate through his contacts. About eventually, when everything was settled, maybe making it official not just emotionally, but legally. About the possibility of more children, an idea that scared and excited me simultaneously. Life, of course, is never completely simple or perfectly happy. There were still nights when Dante came back tense from meetings he didn't discuss, moments when I saw the darkness he carried emerge briefly, before being pushed back down. There were occasions when Lucas had nightmares, calling for me in panic, reminders that trauma doesn't disappear, it just becomes more manageable with time. There were moments when I questioned myself, wondering if I was being naive, if I was choosing another kind of prison disguised as freedom. But then there were mornings like today, waking with sunlight streaming through our bedroom window, Dante still asleep beside me with a relaxed expression he only showed in these private moments. There were afternoons watching Lucas play soccer in the garden with some of the staff's children that Dante had allowed, genuine laughter filling the air. There were nights when the three of us cuddled on the sofa watching ridiculous movies, Dante commenting on historical inaccuracies and Lucas laughing at him. I learned that redemption isn't a single event, but an ongoing process. Dante was constantly working to transition his businesses to legal operations, a process that would take years, but that he was committed to completing, especially now that he had something beyond obligation motivating him. He was building a different legacy than the one he had inherited, one that perhaps one day Lucas could inherit with pride rather than burden. As for me, I was relearning who I was beyond victim, beyond mother, beyond survivor. I was discovering that I was smart, capable, strong in ways I had forgotten during years of being diminished. I was rediscovering passion, not just romantic, but passion for life, for possibilities, for the future. And Lucas was growing in an environment of stability and love, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his well-being. He would have challenges, certainly. Growing up knowing the truth about Dante's world wouldn't be easy, but he would have choices I didn't have, emotional tools and education that would allow him to navigate any path he chose. Rosa often told me that children are resilient, that with love and security, they can overcome just about anything. I was betting that the love now filling our atypical life would be foundation enough for any future storm. Sometimes, at night, when the house is quiet and it's just Dante and me, we talk about that first day. About the absurd courage of a 6-year-old child who ran to ask for help from the most dangerous man he knew. About decisions made in fractions of a second that completely altered the course of multiple lives. About how love can arise from the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people. Dante always ends those conversations by saying that it was Lucas who saved him as much as he saved us. That brave-eyed boy reminded him that there was more to life than power and territory, that there were real human connections worth protecting. I don't know what the future holds. Dante's world will always carry risks. There will always be potential threats emerging from the shadows. But we will face them together. A family built not of blood or convention, but of choice and commitment. A family born from chaos, but forged into something strong and true. And every morning I wake up safe. Every night I fall asleep loved. Every time I see Lucas smile without fear, I know we made the right choices. That sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that redemption is possible even for those the world has already judged and condemned. Our story began with a desperate child's cry for help, and the unlikely response of a man the world saw only as a villain. But it ended, or rather continues, as something much more complex and beautiful. A story of survival transformed into life, of fear transformed into love, of unlikely endings that are just new beginnings in disguise.